Hello YouTube, Bane666 here. So, I found a very interesting story, a very interesting bias story from the ABC. That's the Australian Broadcasting Corporation. This is where my tax dollars are going. And this very biased article about domestic violence tells us a story about a woman who was arrested for abusing her partner, who I now believe is her ex-partner. And the reporter tells us that this is actually a great injustice because she was actually the victim. Now, the reporter has no way of knowing who was actually the victim and who was the victimizer, apart from the word of this particular woman who was arrested for being a victimizer. And at no point does the reporter get the other side of the story. Now, obviously, I wasn't there that night that the cops were called. I don't know what actually happened between these two. We're only getting one side of the story, and that side of the story is somewhat biased. So I, nor anyone else, can really pass judgment upon what happened that night. Although we do have certain clues based upon what's said in this particular article. It's not actually just what's said, but it's also what's conveniently left out. And based on this, we can speculate about what might have actually happened. But more importantly, we can ask a lot of questions, which is what the journalist should have done before coming to the conclusion that anyone with a vagina is obviously the victim, even if they're arrested for being violent towards their partner. But anyway, without any further delay, let's get stuck into it. The article is by Emma Younger, and it's called When Police Misjudge Domestic Violence, Victims Are Slapped with Intervention Order Applications. Now, as we'll see in the article, she's talking about when females claim that they're victims and are slapped with intervention order applications. Now, I have no doubt that there are some females who are victims who, for some reason, get blamed for being a victimizer. Just as I accept that there are men in that situation. In fact, there would be more men in that situation. But the reporter's not going to talk about that. She's not going to give both sides of the story. In her opinion, and in the opinion of the people she interviews, as we'll see, vagina equals victim and penis equals perpetrator. And you really don't need anything else apart from that to come to those conclusions. It's really that simple. So the first paragraph reads, When Stephanie's partner called the police to report her, she was actually relieved. Mark had attacked her before. She had threatened to call 000, but he hid their phones. But when Stephanie fought back on this night, Mark locked himself in a room in their house and called police to report that he'd been assaulted. Okay, so let's break this down. According to Stephanie, Mark, her partner, or ex-partner now, has attacked her numerous times before. He's got a history of violence. Now, do we have any evidence of this apart from Stephanie's word? No, we know that we don't, because she says she threatened to call 000, but he hid their phones, right? Now, this is what someone would say if they're accusing someone of having a history of domestic abuse, but they don't actually have any evidence to back it up. They would make an excuse as to why they don't have any evidence. Now, it is possible that what Stephanie is saying is true. Maybe Mark is controlling, maybe he's violent, he's domineering, he hid all the phones, he controlled her, he prevented her from ringing 000 to call the cops. But that doesn't really make a lot of sense, because the one time, according to her, she fought back, he runs and locks himself in a room and calls the police. That's not really the actions of someone who's violent and domineering. If he's gone to all the trouble of hiding phones before when he's been violent so she can't ring the cops, I don't think he's going to run away the one time she hits him back. If anything, someone like that would probably just knock her out, right? That's what a violent, domineering man would do, a controlling, violent, domineering man. But instead he runs away and calls the cops. Also, if he has been violent in the past, if he has attacked her numerous times in the past, it wouldn't be a smart thing to call the cops. I would imagine the last thing you'd want to do is have the cops anywhere near your battered partner, right? Because chances are she's going to fucking say something. Especially if you've gone to all this trouble of hiding phones in the past so she can't call them. Now he's calling them. He's doing the exact opposite. He's doing the exact thing that he supposedly prevented her from doing. So she can now talk to the cops and tell them how violent he is. Now, I guess it is possible that Mark is a complete fucking idiot. It's also possible that he was drunk or under the influence of some other drug. It's also quite possible that he's just a victim. Now, I said at the start that the interesting thing about this article is that you can tell a lot from what's left out of the story and not just what's reported in the story. And at no time throughout the entire story are we told of any injuries to Stephanie. Now, I find this very strange. The author of this article clearly has a bias towards Stephanie. She clearly has a narrative to push. She is clearly trying to paint Stephanie as a victim. Now, I guarantee you, if Stephanie had been beaten in any significant way, if she had bruises or a bloody nose or a broken arm or anything like that, it would have been mentioned in great detail in this article. But we don't hear of any injuries for Stephanie, not so much as a bruise, which makes me think that if Mark did hit her, it wasn't a particularly violent hit. Now, obviously, any violence is wrong. I'm not suggesting that it's okay to hit your partner in any way, but there are degrees, obviously. There's a difference between, say, pushing someone when you're in the middle of an argument and punching them repeatedly in the face or fracturing their skull with a hammer. There are degrees, obviously. So I imagine if Mark did actually touch her in any way, that it was slight. Now, what further backs this up is when the cops turn up, as we will see in a little bit when we get further into the article, they took his side of the story and arrested her. Now, I can't imagine they would do that if she was bruised and bloody. You know, if she had an arm half hanging off and was in urgent medical need, I can't imagine they would say, well, you know, she must be the perpetrator. Now, we don't hear about any injuries to Mark either. There's a couple of possibilities why this might be the case. The first one is Mark didn't have any injuries. Maybe they just pushed each other and Mark, for some reason, overreacted and locked himself in a room and called the cops on her. Or, quite possibly, Mark did have injuries, and we're not hearing them because we're only hearing Stephanie's side of the story, and it really wouldn't support her case if she mentioned that Mark was, you know, bruised and bloodied, or she had used a weapon or something like that. All these things are possibilities. I can't say for sure, but the fact that the cops took his side of the story and arrested her, as along with the fact that he had to lock himself in a room and call the cops, makes me think that her violence may have been somewhat more significant than his. That is, if he was even violent. Anyway, let's continue. When two police officers arrived at their door, Stephanie's relief soon turned to panic. After police interviewed Stephanie and Mark separately, the officers told her they evaluated the situation and that she had been identified as the predominant aggressor. Yes, I wonder why. Possibly because she was the predominant aggressor, right? Do you think that might be the actual case? Let's read on and see if we can figure this out. Shortly afterwards, she was in the back of a divvy van on her way to the police station, leaving her baby at home in a pram with her abuser. Now, once again, we can tell a lot about this story by what's left out of it, and at no point in this story does it say anywhere that Mark was found guilty of domestic violence. So, at very best, that should be accused abuser, because Mark has not been found guilty in a court of law. In fact, the only evidence we have that he is an abuser is Stephanie's word, as we will see later on. She admits to having absolutely no evidence that she is the victim. Of course, this is all ignored by the reporter because, vagina equals victim, penis equals perpetrator, right? So even though this man has not been found guilty and there is no evidence that he's an actual abuser, he's labelled as the abuser anyway. Next. At the station, police made an application for an intervention order against her. Stephanie said Mark later said he called the police to get back at her. If so, it worked. Now listen to the wording here. Stephanie said Mark later said he called the police to get back at her. So once again, the only evidence we have is the side of the story of the abuser. That is the person who was arrested for abuse. Now it is possible, Mark did say this to her, it is possible Mark did call the police to get back at her, but like I said, that would be an incredibly stupid thing for an abuser to do, right? I imagine the last thing you want to do is to get the cops involved if you've been abusing your partner. The last thing you want to do is to have them talk to her, right? That doesn't make sense. So, although it's possible Mark may have done and said this, I'm not convinced. But it is something that someone would make up if they're trying to cover their abuse. Right, Stephanie? Next. Stephanie was immediately banned from going back home. On top of that, Child Protection Services were called in to ensure she didn't pose a risk to her baby. She would need to go to court to clear her name. Yep. It's shocking, isn't it, when a woman is treated like a man is normally treated under these circumstances. Now, every time we bring up father's rights, the argument we hear back is the safety of the child comes first. If we say, hey, this man over here has been falsely accused, he's been separated from his kids by his lying wife, here's the evidence, the argument we get in return is, why take a chance? The safety of the child is the most important thing. That comes before the rights of the father. Why take the chance that maybe he is guilty? But apparently that same logic doesn't apply when the alleged abuser is the mother, even though mothers are twice as likely to abuse their kids than the father. This article forgot to mention that little bit, didn't it? I guess it was just too busy painting all men as victimizers and all women as victims. Next. I was removed. I was taken in the back of a division van like a criminal. I was locked in a room and then I had to go to court to try to prove I'm not a risk to this man, Stephanie said. Yeah, that happens to men all the fucking time, doesn't it? And to be fair, some of those men are actually guilty of domestic abuse. But not all of them. So what is Stephanie suggesting? That we should have separate standards for men and women when they're accused of domestic violence? I'm guessing that's what the reporter in this article is suggesting. I know it's what some of the people she talks to is suggesting, as we'll see. Apparently that's equality these days. Next. Her story is not unusual. Really. So there are a lot of women being arrested for domestic violence. That's interesting. Maybe we should be talking about that more. Next. Research by Women's Legal Services Victoria suggests Victorian police are repeatedly mistaking domestic violence victims for perpetrators. Yes, it's nice to see that the ABC is using an unbiased organisation like the Women's Legal Service. I'm sure that they are not biased in any way against men, and I'm sure when they say are repeatedly mistaking domestic violence victims for perpetrators that they're including men as well, right? Of course, I'm joking. Of course, they're not talking about men. They're talking about women who have been arrested for domestic abuse, and apparently they should automatically be treated as victims even when there's evidence that they're perpetrators. But once again, if this is such an issue, if there are so many women who are being falsely accused of domestic violence, that would suggest that a lot of women are actually being arrested for domestic violence. Maybe we should stop looking at domestic violence as a gendered situation then, right? I guess that would go against the feminist narrative though, wouldn't it? Next. And bungling the issuing of intervention orders designed to protect them. Okay, what they really mean here is designed to protect women. Not victims, but women. Now, that's women who are victims, and it's also women who are victimizers. And too bad if a man's a victim, right? Because we have to protect the children and the women. But if a woman is a victim, or cries victim, that's an entirely different story. See, it's nice and easy to know who's guilty and who's innocent, because you just have to look at the gender of the two people, and that's it. We don't even need courts anymore. Feminists just make it so easy. They've simplified the entire legal system for us. Next. It looked at the cases of 500 clients in the Melbourne Magistrates Court between January and May of this year, and found 1 in 8 police applications for intervention orders were made against the wrong person. No link, I see. Made against the wrong person. So what I'm guessing what they mean is made against someone with a vagina, because we all know that's the wrong person. So would that suggest that 1 in 8 people being arrested for domestic abuse are women in Victoria? That's quite a lot. Why are all the domestic abuse ads on TV about female victims and male perpetrators?
You pop those down there. You're okay. Just did it because he likes you.
Don't try like a girl, mate. Come on.
Look at that. Yes.
Why are you doing this? You're okay. He loves you.
No, what are you doing?
What do you mean, what do I do?
Violence against women starts with disrespect. The excuses we make allow it to grow. Violence against women. Let's stop it at the start. Authorised by the Australian Government, Canberra.
If 1 in 8 are actually female, because I guarantee you the Women's Legal Service Victoria is not talking about male victims here. As we will see later in the article, their ideology is extremely gendered. So 1 in 8 people arrested for domestic abuse in Victoria are female. At least 1 in 8. That's extremely interesting. I'd love the media to actually talk about that. And technically, I know someone might point out, technically the media is talking about it because it's mentioned in an article here, but it's actually painting it in an entirely different light. It's saying these women are victims as opposed to these women were actually arrested for being victimizers. Next. The research found cases where clients had been served intervention order applications despite not even being questioned by police. Okay, now I am not an expert on the law, and I'm sure someone will correct me in the comment section if I get anything wrong here, although keep in mind that I'm sure the laws change from state to state and from country to country, so I'm talking about specifically in Victoria here. But my understanding is an intervention order is just a restraining order, and the person the intervention order is being made against does not have to be interviewed. All right, you're not being found guilty of a crime. It's basically an order saying stay away from this person, and if you don't, there will be consequences. Now, to be more specific, what we're talking about is an application for an intervention order, not the actual intervention order itself. The person still has to go to court, and the accused has the opportunity to defend themselves under those circumstances. So the police can issue an application for an intervention order if they believe that a crime has taken place. So let me give you an example that feminists should be able to understand, because I'm going to be using a female victim. They seem to be able to understand these circumstances when we explain it with female victims, but not so much with male victims for some reason. So imagine there's a call for a domestic violence dispute. Let's say a neighbour calls the cops, and the cops turn up, and there's a woman, and she's got a black eye, and she's got blood pouring out of her nose, and her clothing is ripped, and the front door is half ripped off the hinges, and the cops interview her and say what happened, and she says, my drunken, violent partner Bob brutally assaulted me, and then he left. Now, should the police wait until they interview Bob before they issue an application for an intervention order? Or should they maybe issue an application for an intervention order based on the evidence that they have in front of them? Now, it may be that Bob is totally innocent, right? Maybe it's a false accusation despite the evidence, in which case Bob will have the opportunity to defend himself in court. Once again, this is an application for an intervention order, not the actual intervention order itself. Now, if someone is believed to be in danger, the court can issue a temporary intervention order until the court case takes place. And I would imagine, in the example I just gave, that's what would happen. So I don't see what the problem is with police issuing applications for intervention orders. They obviously have some reason to think that there is a need to do this. And if the person has been falsely accused, they have the opportunity to defend themselves in court. Now, I'm not saying the court system is perfect or isn't without bias, but the accused does have the opportunity to defend themselves, which isn't the suggestion that this article is making. This article is making the suggestion that the cops are somehow finding someone guilty without even so much as interviewing the accused. Once again, let me stress, this is an application. And the Women's Legal Service Victoria has an entire section dedicated to intervention orders and how they're issued. They don't really seem to have an issue when these application orders are placed on men, regardless of whether the men have been interviewed or not. Because, we have to be concerned about the women's safety, right? That's my layman's understanding of intervention orders. Once again, please correct me if I'm wrong. If there's anyone from Victoria who knows more about this, by all means, correct me if I get something wrong here. Next. It says others were questioned but were not given access to an interpreter despite having limited English. Yeah, I see that as a fair complaint, right? But what about the circumstances? Now, a lot of family violence happens late Friday and Saturday nights between 6 p.m. and 6 a.m. and involve alcohol and drugs. So I imagine if the cops turn up at a domestic abuse call at 2 in the morning, they're not going to have a lot of access to interpreters. Okay, there's not going to be 50 interpreters to cover all the different languages that people could speak, just waiting there to be called by the cops to come out and see what's going on. I imagine under those circumstances the police would do the very best they can. It goes on to say, and that at least one woman has been served with an intervention order application while in hospital recovering from injuries inflicted by her violent partner. Well, I imagine that is possible, but I would like to look at the case in a little bit more detail before just accepting that, because I think that version of events might be somewhat biased. I think it might be a little bit exaggerated, or I think certain bits of information may be left out. Now, it is possible that it did happen the way it is presented there, but I'd really like to see a little bit more detail about the specific circumstances. For example, did the police issue intervention orders to both parties? Or did they only issue an intervention order towards the woman in the hospital? In what condition was the man? Was he also in hospital? Did he have injuries? Is this a situation where both parties were violent towards one another? Or is this a situation where the man was violent and the woman was the victim? That's what's being presented here, but we don't know if that was actually the circumstances. And if both parties are violent, which is a very real possibility, then what is wrong with issuing intervention orders to both of them? Isn't it the best thing to keep both of these parties separated? Maybe, now here's a crazy argument, maybe the man inflicted injuries on the woman in self-defense. Now that shouldn't be a hard argument for feminists to understand, because they make that argument all the time when women use violence against their partners. They say, well, you know, the only reason that woman hurt her partner was in self-defense. In fact, Stephanie is making that very argument in this fucking article. So, yeah, maybe the partner had been attacked and defended himself, which in turn put his female partner in hospital. Or maybe he's just a violent thug. We don't know, because we haven't looked at the circumstances of the case. And I'm not willing to accept the word of the Women's Legal Service Victoria, because, you know, maybe they've got a bit of an agenda when it comes to this stuff. So in the last couple of paragraphs, we're given a whole heap of statistics which supposedly come from the Women's Legal Service Victoria. I say supposedly because I can't find any evidence that it actually does. Apart from this single tweet, which is referring to a news story which is related to the article I'm going through. Now, I've looked for a copy of that news story from the 14th or 15th of August, but I've been unable to find it. But I'll keep searching, and if I find it before I finish and publish this video, then I'll include it. Otherwise, if I do find it afterwards, I'll include it in a separate video. Now, the ABC has given us some little graphics of this information. It's got here 57% of women named as perpetrators were actually victims. Data, Women's Legal Service Victoria. Now, I assume the ABC put this together because I did an image search and couldn't find it. The image actually coming from the Women's Legal Service Victoria, although the image has been shared quite a bit on the internet. So I'm guessing this is the origin of this graphic. But I also couldn't find this claim on the Women's Legal Service Victoria website. So I also did a search on the internet for Women's Legal Service Victoria, 57%, and couldn't find anything. I also did a search for the statement, 57% of women named as perpetrators were actually victims, and found no results. The closest I could find to it was from an article in The Independent, which said more than half of female prisoners are victims of domestic violence, new research shows. So this is a similar claim, but it's different. This claim is saying that 57% of women in prison have also been victims of domestic violence. So that's not the claim that the ABC has made. But I do find it strange that both claims have the 57% figure, and I can't find where the ABC claim has come from. I know where they're saying it comes from, but it doesn't seem to actually come from that source. Now, the other graphic they have is 1 in 8 wrongly named as aggressor. And we clearly see the 1 in 8 figure here is female. So I did a search for Women's Legal Service Victoria, 1 in 8, and couldn't find where that citation came from. Now, maybe all this information is from a report which hasn't been published yet, and maybe the reporter was given an advanced copy of it or something. But if that's the case, then it prevents us from actually looking at the data, right? We're unable to look at the data to see how it was collected, to see if it's been interpreted the right way, to see if the reporter has presented it correctly, to see if there's any logical fallacies or any faults in the way it's been put together. We're prevented from verifying this information. We're presented this information in such a way that we just have to take it at face value. And I'm not willing to do that. I'm not willing to do that because both the reporter who has written this article and the Women's Legal Service Victoria clearly have a massive bias. So if you want me to believe your claims, you're going to have to prove them. That simple. Next. Victoria's Chief Commissioner of Police, Graham Ashton, acknowledged that historically officers on the scene were misidentifying victims as perpetrators more often than the force wanted. Let me interpret this for you. What he's saying is that they have a stereotype of male offender, female victim, but for some reason the police are arresting women, which doesn't fit that ideological stereotype. Therefore, the police must be making mistakes, as opposed to women actually being violent and being arrested, and the police making good judgments. More often than the force want it, though. That's the words it uses, which once again makes me think that maybe there are more women being arrested for domestic violence than we're being told. Next. The training that we've been providing through the Centre of Learning at the Academy has been all about lifting the standard across the state in relation to the issue so that everyone gets good quality of training, he said. What we're finding was some parts of Victoria where we delivered specialised training were going well. Other parts who didn't have access to that same training weren't going as well. Graham Ashton says responding to family violence calls consumes a staggering 40% of the work of Victorian police. Officers are called on to make judgments on the spot in enormously stressful circumstances where manipulation and deceit are often embedded in the conflict between partners. Yes, and that happens on both sides. That's something which is done by both males and females, right? But that's not the picture painted by this article, is it? Next. When Stephanie's then partner called the police, he claimed she was psychotic and heavily medicated. None of this was true. Now, how does the reporter know that none of this was true? Oh, that's right. She just asked Stephanie. Because, of course, if Stephanie was psychotic and she was the violent offender, she would just admit it to the reporter, right? Of course she would. If she was psychotic, she wouldn't deny being psychotic. She wouldn't accuse her victim of making that up, would she? Of course not. I mean, Stephanie's a woman. Of course she wouldn't lie. So we've learned a couple of things so far, right? What we know we can do away with the court system because men are just automatically victimizers and women are automatically victims. And apparently we can do away with psych evaluations. All we have to do is ask someone if they're psychotic, and if they say no, then apparently they're not. Sorry, this only applies to women, of course, right? I have to make that clear. I don't want men thinking that, they can just get away with something. Next. When she was taken to the police station, she said she continually told the officers, "He hit me first, I am the victim. He hit me first." So she has admitted to hitting him. Now she's claiming she hit him in self-defense, but that claim includes the fact that she did hit him. So the very best case scenario for Stephanie is that they were violent towards each other. And that's a very real possibility. It's a very real possibility we're dealing with two violent people here. And this is a regular thing. Of course, we don't know that because we haven't heard Mark's side of the story. And we haven't heard from the cops either, have we? You know, the two people who actually turned up and interviewed them on the night, got both sides of the story and made an evaluation. I would imagine that what they had to say would be rather important, right? Apparently not. Apparently Stephanie's word is good enough. That's the standard for reporting these days. If she's got a vagina, then you just believe everything she says without question. And remember, as we're about to see in a minute, Stephanie admits that there's no evidence to support the fact that she was a victim. She actually admits that, but we'll get to that in a minute. Next. But they didn't believe her. Okay. Now, the question the journalist should be asking is, why didn't they believe her? Now, I'm pretty sure the journalist thinks it's because she is a woman, which I find strange because I think the cops would be more willing to believe a female victim of domestic abuse. So that makes me think that there must have been some other evidence to support Mark's claim. Like I said, maybe he was bruised, maybe he was bleeding, maybe he had wounds, right? And as we're about to see in a second, maybe Stephanie was acting psychotic. Do you think that might have had something to do with her being arrested? Next. I feel like they were treating me like a screaming female who does this all the time, who's psychotic, she said. Now, I find her wording very, very interesting. Treating me like a screaming female. Now, why would the cops treat someone like a screaming female unless she was a screaming female? If Stephanie was perfectly calm and trying to just tell her side of the story, why would they treat her like a screaming female? And exactly how do you treat a calm person who isn't screaming like a screaming female? I'm not exactly sure how you do that. Now, I imagine if someone was screaming, you would tell them to calm down, right? And I imagine that's what's happened. And she also says who's psychotic. Now, it's the second time that she's used that word. She first said that Mark claimed that she was psychotic to the police, and now she's claiming that the police saw her as psychotic. I find that rather interesting that she's used that word twice. Now, it's possible that it came up in the conversation with the cops. Maybe they said, Mark's called you psychotic. I don't know if they'd do that, though. But if it didn't come up in the conversation, I think Stephanie may have shown her hand here. Anyway, let's continue. I would have liked to have been believed that my ex-partner was the one who initiated the physical violence. Initiated the physical violence, not was physically violent. So once again, we have a circumstance where at very best for Stephanie, both people were violent. That's the very best case scenario for her. Of course, the other scenario is that Mark wasn't violent at all and he was the actual victim. Now, once again, we don't know because we haven't heard Mark's side, nor have we heard what the cops saw that night. We just get Stephanie's side of the story. Apparently that's good enough. Next. The police issued a family violence safety notice against Stephanie, banning her from returning to the home she shared with Mark. Yeah, and that's the type of thing that happens to men all the fucking time. You wanted equality? Hey, here it is. Next. Fortunately, she was able to stay with her parents. For other women, it can result in homelessness. Oh no, not homelessness. You know, that thing that affects men vastly more than women. And I imagine at least some of those men might be in similar circumstances, considering men are more likely to have family violence safety notices placed against them and be unable to return to their home. And that some of those men would actually be innocent. But of course, we won't mention any of that, will we? Apparently this is something that only happens to women. Or, to be more accurate, it's only important when it happens to women. Apparently it's just unimportant when it happens to men. Doesn't matter for some reason. Next. It took 3 court appearances before police agreed to withdraw their application for an intervention order against Stephanie. Okay, my question would be why? Why were the police pursuing this? Did they have evidence that Stephanie was actually the perpetrator? My other question would be, why did they finally withdraw it? Did they get pressure from up above? Because, hey, we can't possibly prosecute a woman for family violence, can we? That's something only men do, remember? So once again, a bit more detail would be good, Maybe the reporter should be doing her job and giving us a bit more information about the circumstances, instead of just making assumptions. Next. They had been persisting with the order despite her then partner asking police to drop it. This is very interesting, and it shows a massive double standard when it comes to feminists and domestic violence. You see, there has always been an issue with victims dropping charges against their victimizers. It's a common thing. In fact, the laws in America were changed from memory back in the 90s because police were turning up to domestic violence situations and the victim didn't want to press charges. So thanks to feminists pressuring the government, the laws were changed so someone had to be arrested. Of course, this resulted in a large number of women being arrested. Who would have guessed that? Not the feminists is the answer to that question. So they then changed the law so it was the dominant aggressor, which basically means most of the time it's the man. One of the criteria from memory is which partner is larger. So it makes the assumption that if one partner is larger than the other, then that partner is more likely to be the dominant aggressor. In other words, almost always the man. Next. Stephanie's duty lawyer had identified her as a victim rather than a perpetrator and worked to have the application withdrawn. Wow, that was really good work of her duty lawyer to do that. I wonder what evidence the duty lawyer had to make that distinction, to come to the conclusion that Stephanie was actually a victim as opposed to a perpetrator. I mean, I'm sure the duty lawyer must have had something to indicate that Stephanie was the victim and wasn't just going on Stephanie's word, right? Next. I was just so relieved that somebody actually believed me, because I don't know how I was going to prove that I was not the aggressor in this situation, Stephanie said. So I guess she didn't have any evidence that she was the victim. That's what she's just said here. She was relieved that someone actually believed her, and she didn't know how she was going to prove that she wasn't the aggressor. In other words, there's no evidence that she's the victim. None. Yet her duty lawyer somehow determined that Stephanie was actually the victim, as did the reporter, without talking to Mark, or the police, or anyone else, apparently. Next. But she also had other hurdles to jump, including convincing the Department of Health and Human Services that she did not pose a risk to her baby. Yeah. Once again, when men are in this situation, we're told that the safety of the child is the most important thing. But when women are in this situation, we're told that the rights of the woman apparently is the most important thing, even more so than the safety of the child. Isn't that interesting? And of course, that's not a double standard, because patriarchy or something. Next. She still becomes emotional talking about having to convince a government worker that she would never hurt her child. Yeah, because, people who hurt their kids admit it all the time, don't they? Now, I don't know if she's ever hurt her child or whether she would. Maybe she's a perfect mother. Maybe she's completely non-violent apart from this one particular time where she lost her shit and defended herself against her ex-male partner. Or maybe she's psychotic and violent. It would be nice to determine that, wouldn't it? Next. I was worried they were going to take her away from me. It was so scary, she said. Yeah, now you know what it's like to be a father, right? Next. Eventually, DHHS told Stephanie they had closed her case file and no action would be taken. Identifying the aggressor, a difficult task. Victorian police has a code officers are meant to follow to identify the predominant aggressor in family violence incident. Yet I believe there's a new code coming out next year. The police officer just determines which of the two people has a penis, and apparently that is the predominant aggressor. It's a streamlined simplification of the whole system. Next. They're also required to fill out a risk assessment which involves identifying which person is more fearful, whether either person has defensive injuries, I wonder if Mark had any, or if there is a history of coercion, intimidation and violence. But it's a complex task. Yes, that's the point. And let's have a look at these things here and apply them to what we know about the case. Which person is more fearful? Well, Mark locked himself in a room and rang the cops. And it seems, from what Stephanie was saying, that she was screaming and possibly psychotic. So I think that one might be in favour of Mark. Now, I don't know if Mark had any defensive injuries because we're not told the extent of the violence used against him. We know Stephanie hit him because she said so. We don't know how she hit him or what she hit him with or how many times she hit him. Now, once again, to be fair, we don't know how many times Mark hit her or how he hit her or how hard he hit her. But I imagine, like I said earlier, he didn't hit or injure her in any significant way. Otherwise, that would have been mentioned in great detail in this article. And the last bit, it says, history of coercion, intimidation and violence. Well, we know that Mark has no history of coercion, intimidation or violence because right at the start of this article, Stephanie said that Mark has attacked her numerous times, but he's always somehow managed to prevent her from ringing the cops, which is her way of explaining why there isn't a history of coercion, intimidation or violence. So once again, all we have to go on with that is Stephanie's word. So based on those criteria, yeah, I can imagine they would have arrested Stephanie. But, you know, once again, let me stress, I wasn't there. That's purely speculation based on bits and pieces in a one-sided article. Next. When police arrive at an incident, those involved might be highly emotional, drug or alcohol affected, or unwilling to disclose the full story or what has gone on. Yeah, I imagine that happens all the fucking time. In fact, an extremely high percentage of domestic violence situations involve drugs or alcohol. I imagine it's a very common thing, and I imagine it would be hard to determine who is the victim and who is the victimizer in many cases. And I imagine also in many cases they're both guilty. That kind of goes against the feminist narrative though, doesn't it? Next. The statistics show a woman is far more likely to be a victim, but not in every case. 1 in 6 Australian women compared to 1 in 16 men have been subjected to physical or sexual violence by a current or previous cohabiting partner, according to the Australian Bureau of Statistics Personal Safety Survey. So that's more than 1/4 of victims being men, based on that survey, and I think that the percentage of male victims might be a bit higher than that. But I tell you what, let's go with the stats that we have here. Let's give them the best case scenario. That's 1 in 4 victims. Now, that's a fairly significant number considering the constant stream of advertisements we have in the media here that show us that the women are victims and men are victimizers. That is what we constantly hear, day in, day out. Male victimizer, female victim. It's a strange message, considering 1/4 of victims are actually male. It's also interesting that all the money goes to female services. Not 3/4 of it, but all of it. And as I've pointed out before, there's actually more shelters for the animals of female victims than there are for men in Australia. Isn't that nice? We gotta look after those dogs and cats before we look after men, right? Next. Officers are receiving targeted training on how to identify perpetrators at the Force's Family Violence Centre for Learning, which was established in response to a recommendation of the Royal Commission into Family Violence. Well, I'm sure they're completely impartial, right? I'm sure they're not teaching anything to do with ideological feminism and the gender-biased narrative of male perpetrator, female victim. Next. But Women's Legal Service Senior Policy Lawyer Marianne Jago said officers still seemed unfamiliar with the code of practice and did not have the training required to deal with what are complex situations. Aggressors are gaming the system. They know that if they call the police first, that the police are more likely to believe they are the victim and not the aggressor, she said. Oh, that's what the men are doing. When a woman calls the police saying that she's a victim, that's because she's a victim. But when a man calls the police first, that's because he's the aggressor. So it's who needs courts? We should just arrest all men. You know, it's really that simple when you look at it. It's much easier to have empathy for someone who looks like a victim. What, you mean women? Or are you talking about men who are bruised and bloodied? Which one? So who's crying and is really asking for your protection? Okay, so she's saying that men beat their wives, then they call the police claiming that they're the victim, and they cry when the cops turn up. Yeah, that sounds that sounds feasible, doesn't it? It sounds much more believable than some women are violent, because we know that would never happen. So if she's not like that, if she's drug affected, or if she's any range of factors that don't buy into the more appealing victim dynamic, you mean screaming like a psychotic woman? Is that what you mean? So you're saying that screaming like a psychotic woman is not an indicator that someone is a victim? Okay, I'm taking notes. Okay, just let me write that down. It's harder for them to elicit that protection response from the police, she said. Yeah, maybe because they're not victims. Did you ever think of that? Oh, of course not. Specialist backup required men's referral service. The head of No to Violence, I don't think that's the full title. If I was to guess the full title of this organisation, it would be No to Violence Against Women. Or possibly No to Violence Against Women because violence only happens to women. I think No to Violence is the short version, as we're about to see. An organisation that works with male perpetrators of family violence and provides telephone counselling services. Yes, but not male victims or female perpetrators. Yeah, because they don't need any help, do they? Said the men who work with the service almost always present as the victim of the system, the courts, or their partner's behaviour. Well, the wording here is very interesting. Once again, he says, the men who work with the service almost always present as the victims of the system, the courts, or their partner's behaviour. Yes, but not their partner's violence. That one's been left out, hasn't it? And Mark isn't presenting himself as a victim of the system, or the courts, or his partner's behaviour. According to this article, now of course we don't get Mark's version, but I think it's safe to say, based on this article, Mark was presenting himself to the cops as the victim of Stephanie's violence. Not her behaviour, not the courts, not the system. That's something completely different, isn't it? Next. This is a really hard job for the police when they're called to specific incidents, and partly it's because family violence is not an incident. It's a pattern of behaviour and a pattern of coercive control over time. No to Violence Chief Executive Jackie Watt said. Okay, so it's not two people getting drunk and having an argument which turns violence. It's the patriarchy oppressing women and males asserting their dominance over women, right? I mean, we've heard all this shit before from the Duluth model, right? This is Feminism 101. It's all based on ideology. It's not based on individual circumstances or individual cases. It goes on to say. So we are worried that men are now seeing it as fit to claim victimhood as part of their tools and tactics in undermining their partner. I say men are doing that. Well, I'm glad no women have ever done that. I'm glad, that there's never been a woman in the history of mankind who has claimed to be a victim to win custody of her kids in a divorce. How fortunate that women have never done that, right? Next. Miss Watt said police needed to become more sophisticated in assessing a single incident and how it might fit into a pattern of abuse. Okay, so, in other words, he who has a penis is guilty. Next. What I'd like to think is that we can provide specialist backup services within a short time of police being called to a certain incident, she said. Well, that's exactly what we need, isn't it? We have a situation where two police are called to a family violence situation, and the police turn up and they separate the two people and they interview both parties and they get both sides of the story, and instead of coming to a conclusion, they ring a feminist organisation to come out and make that conclusion for them based on bigoted stereotypes and ideology. What could go wrong with that, right? Next. So if there's any doubt in the police person's mind about whether it's a genuine victim situation or not, they've got someone to call. Yeah, what could go wrong with that? Miss Jago acknowledged the difficulties police face in determining who needs protection, but denied it was an unsurmountable challenge. If every station spent an hour going through the code of practice and discussing their best practice and what they're expecting from their members, we could solve this really quickly, she said. Really? It's funny because the article just said before how hard it is to determine who might be telling the truth in that circumstance, right? It said that people might be drunk, they don't tell you the whole story, that they might be lying. But, all it takes is half an hour to explain it to the cops at their station before they go out, and apparently they'll just know when they turn up. Once again, penis means you're guilty. Next. Miss Jago said the experience was soul-destroying for women like Stephanie. Yes, but not men in that situation, right? It's not soul-destroying when a man is falsely accused of domestic violence, because apparently men don't feel anything. It's only soul-destroying for women like Stephanie, even if they're abusers. Next. You've just been through a family violence incident. Yes, possibly as the aggressor. And all of a sudden you're facing continued violence because he hasn't been apprehended, she said. Yes, I think it is time we start to apprehend male victims. Oh, hold on, we've already been doing that for years, haven't we? Next. But on top of that, you're dealing with the loss of the idea of the police as protective. Well, I imagine there's a lot of men who lost that idea decades ago. Stephanie is certain she would never call the police again. Again? I thought her ex-partner always prevented her from ringing the cops. He always hid the phones in the house and prevented her, so there's never been a record of her being a victim. But she'd never call the police again. even though she wasn't the one who called the police in this particular circumstance. Now, let me stress once again, I do not know what happened that particular night. I don't think anyone knows except Stephanie and Mark, and it's quite possible they were drunk or on drugs or something. There's nothing in the article which says that, but it wouldn't surprise me considering that alcohol or drugs are involved in a high number of domestic abuse situations. So we don't really know what happened, and probably the best people, apart from Stephanie and Mark, who know what happened that night, are the two cops who turned up. So I know I may have been taking Mark's side a little bit in this video, but that's because Mark doesn't have anyone to speak up for him. His side of the story isn't presented, and I don't know if I fully believe Stephanie's side of the story. There seems to be a few inconsistencies. And even if there wasn't, I'd be very cautious about believing something so one-sided. This is, after all, not just an article talking about an individual who's been through a particular bad set of circumstances or a particular bad incident. It's making the case that the entire system is somehow geared against women and that women are the true victims, even when they might actually be the victimizers. So even if it was a well-written article, which it's not, I'd still be a little bit cautious about believing it, because it's incredibly one-sided and clearly has an agenda. So, just to finish up, let me give you a little bit of a scenario. Let's say there's a couple, and late one night they get into an argument, and the man starts acting psychotic, and he violently assaults his female partner. And she's fearful for her life. She locks herself in a room and calls the cops. So the cops turn up, they talk to both parties, they get both sides of the story. She says he's acting psychotic and he's on medication and he's yelling at the cops and making a scene. So they determine that he is the dominant aggressor. They arrest him and take him off to the police station and issue a intervention order, preventing him going back home where he might assault his partner or his child. Now, he gets himself a lawyer, quite a good lawyer, and the lawyer fights the case in the courts, and it takes 3 times for the cops to eventually drop the case, despite the fact that there's evidence against him. And he claims to actually be the real victim. He says, well, the only reason I hit her is because she started it. She hit me first. And he says that she has a long history of being violent. Now, he doesn't have any proof of this because he's never rang the cops, but he claims that she's actually the violent one, despite the evidence that he was the one who assaulted her. So in other words, this is a gender swap version of the story that you've just seen. Now, if that was the case, if that was the story instead of the one you've just seen, do you think that the ABC or any other online publication would be writing an article claiming that the man is the victim and that the woman is really the aggressor and she only rang the cops to get him in trouble? Not a fucking chance. Not a fucking chance in hell. The narrative they would be presenting is that she is the victim in that scenario. And this is proof that we live in a patriarchal society where men look down on women and see them as second-class citizens, and there's an epidemic of domestic violence with males brutally beating women in Australia. Yet, strangely, they didn't come to that conclusion with the story we just heard with Stephanie and Mark, because it seems that no matter what the evidence is, or no matter what the circumstances are, the woman is always the victim and the male is always the perpetrator. And that's because they start with the conclusion and then they work backwards. Instead of trying to determine who is actually the aggressor and who's at fault, And as I said throughout the video, in many cases it's both parties who are violent. But instead of actually looking at the circumstances and trying to determine that, they start with the conclusion and then they look at everything through that lens. And of course, if anyone criticises them for doing this, it's somehow twisted into that person is trying to protect violent men or doesn't really care about women being killed or some fucking bullshit like that. This is nothing but a fucking con job, an ideological con job.